Welcome everybody who's here so far. My name's Laurie Gilman. I'm the co-owner and founder of East City Bookshop here in Washington, D.C. East City Bookshop is a general community bookstore right here, just a few blocks from the U.S. Capitol building in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, which is a residential historic neighborhood that's sort of like its own little small town here right in the middle of the city. We just happen to have a front row seat to all the political things as they happen, which has been very interesting lately, to say the least. I'm not going to take a lot of your time, but I do want to say, please purchase the book from East City Bookshop. We are so grateful to have our author here tonight and our moderator, our representative from the embassy. And we're grateful to have all of you here tonight, but we do depend on people like you to purchase books from small independent bookstores like us. If you don't purchase it from us, purchase it from your own small local independent bookstore. You have kept so many of us going through the pandemic, and we are so appreciative. And we unfortunately have to ask you to just keep it up for a while longer. Okay, one tip, I'll get in trouble if I don't say this. If you have any tech questions or issues, please put that into the chat box. If you have a question for the author or for the moderator, please put that into the Q&A area. That way your question will get answered. We might not see it if it's in the chat box. Okay, so tonight we are so happy to be co-hosting this event with the Embassy of Finland. And I hope that we can work together with you guys again, because this has been a really great experience. I'd like to welcome Suvi Jorvela Hagström, who is the cultural counselor of the Embassy of Finland. She's going to take over the introductions for this evening, and I will leave you in her capable hands. Thank you, Suvi.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and thank you, East City Bookshop. Also from my side, warmly welcome to this very wonderful event. And thank you very much for pronouncing my name so well. It's amazing. I always have to apologize. It's a really, really difficult name. But yes, so we're really excited to partner with the East City Bookshop on this event, and other partners include the Consulate General of Finland in New York. Hello, Anssi and the team. Elina Ahlback, literary agency. Elina is Frank's agent. HarperCollins publishers. And last but not least, our wonderful authors, Emily Esfahani Smith and Frank Martela. And really excited about this topic as well, meaningful life. I think these days, probably many people have wondered about how to bring meaningfulness in one's lives. And that's probably the big question for every one of us, to find answers to how to live a meaningful life. So I'm happy we have two experts who can give us tips today, namely Frank and Emily. So thank you very much for being here with us. I'll introduce you shortly to the audience. So Frank is a PhD, a philosopher, and the researcher of psychology, and obviously also an author who's based in Aalto University in Helsinki. And I think he has done research on meaning in life for around 10 years now. And he has, as Emily as well, spoken to various audiences worldwide. And he has written a wonderful book called A Wonderful Life, Insights for Finding a Meaningful Existence. And I read somewhere that this book has been described by witty and inspirational guidebook, philosophically probing yet eminently readable tour de force of research. So there you have it, translated into 21 languages. And then, of course, Emily Esfahani Smith, thank you for yours as well. Thank you to you two for being here. And she is an author, speaker, and journalist based here in Washington, D.C., and also holds a master in positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. And she has appeared, for example, in NBC's Today Show. And both of the authors have had articles in various publications, and for example, by the New York Times is one of the publications I'd like to maybe mention here. And Emily's book has been translated into 16 languages. It's called Power of Meaning, and I read somewhere it's been described as beautifully written, evidence-based, and inspiring. So it's really great to have you here. And just to tell everybody, the Embassy of Finland and the Consulate General are organizing various events. So please keep us in mind. And obviously, we're happy to do another event with East City Bookshop. Thank you, Laurie. But now let me give the floor to Frank and Emily. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Suvi. So I'm Emily, and I am the author of The Power of Meaning, as Suvi mentioned. And I'm just so excited to be here with you, Frank, to talk about your new book, and with all of you, even though we can't see you guys, it's nice to hear from you in the chat. So I'll just speak a few minutes about my ideas about meaning in my book, and then I think Frank's going to say a few words, and then we'll have a conversation. So I wrote my book, The Power of Meaning, starting sometime, 2012 or so. And at the time I was in school studying positive psychology, which is the science of human well-being. And I kind of, came upon some research that surprised me a bit, kind of pulling apart the difference between meaning and happiness. And it was a distinction I hadn't really thought too much about. And I realized that as I was encountering this research, that in our culture here in America, and I think more broadly in Western culture, there is so much emphasis placed on happiness and why we should pursue happiness. Now, happiness is the be all end all of life. And yet, when we step back, we see that there's been this kind of rising tide of despair across so many dimensions of mental health, from rising suicide rates, rising depression rates, rising rates of anxiety, and so forth, which has only, been magnified recently because of the pandemic. But the startling mental health statistics that we are seeing with the pandemic are really part of a larger trend that's been going on for decades. And the research that I was encountering suggested that pursuing happiness isn't actually going to solve that problem, this kind of problem of emptiness within people, but that when you look at what's predicting this rising tide of despair, it's actually a lack of meaning in people's lives. So there's something about meaning and not necessarily happiness that we need in our lives. And so once I kind of came upon that concept, I began to wonder, well, what exactly is it that we need in our lives in order for our lives to feel meaningful? And this is the research that I basically did for my book. And I did, read many research studies, some of Frank's work. I interviewed a lot of people as a journalist, and eventually, after several years, kind of pulled together the research that I was doing, the stories that people were telling me, and started noticing some themes. And in particular, there were these 4 themes that came up again and again when I talked to people about what made their lives meaningful, and when I looked at what the research said. And they are, first, belonging, so having a relationship where we feel like we're valued and affirmed by others, or even not just a relationship, but just moments of connection where we feel that way. The second is purpose, so having some kind of goal that moves us into the future, that's meaningful to us, but also meaningful to the world at large. The third is storytelling or narrative about how we make sense of ourselves and the world around us. And finally, transcendence, or these moments where we step outside of our small self and connect to something much bigger, whether it's nature, God, universal consciousness, whatever you might call it. So that's kind of the snapshot, and Frank and I can talk maybe a little bit more, but I want to mention just quickly one story, which is really the story that hooked me when I was a grad student into this research on meaning, and that's the story of Viktor Frankl, who I'm sure many here know about. Just very briefly, he was a Jewish psychiatrist living in Vienna when the Nazis came to power. And in 1941 or 1942, the Nazis took him, his pregnant wife, and his parents to the concentration camps. 3 years later, the camps, when the camps were liberated, of course, and the war ended, he had survived, but his wife, his parents, and many others whom he knew and loved had perished, of course. And within a year of being released from the camps, he wrote this book, this beautiful book called Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about how in the camps there were so many who lost everything, lost their livelihoods, their homes, their children, and therefore came away feeling like they had nothing left to live for and kind of gave up on life. And yet there were still at the same time those who took an opposite approach, who continued to believe that their lives were meaningful. And these people, Frankl found, were more resilient in the face of suffering, had more hope, and were even more apt to survive, he said, given the general degradation of camp life. And that's an extreme story, but I think when we look at the research on resilience, the more modern research from psychology on resilience and suffering, we find the same idea borne out, that people who have meaning are able to kind of withstand suffering with more fortitude, and afterwards, after the period of difficulty, they're more likely to actually grow as a result of it. So that's something that I've been thinking about as we kind of go through this this universal experience of hardship and difficulty during the pandemic. So Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thanks, Emily, for your introductory words. And I agree with you that that I also have been thinking about Viktor Frankl during this pandemic. That that he's teaching about this meaning as a source of resilience seems to be something that is quite relevant in this moment. That when people go through great suffering, when they have this sense that hey, they have some like clear purpose in their life, a clear sense of meaning that might like help them to carry through these moments of suffering. And I also want to like thank Emily for I think when I was like starting my book project, I think it was quite helpful that your book was already out there, because I think I'm trying to convince the publishers that that there's a market for books about science-based book about the topic of meaning. That seemed to be like quite hard at some point, but luckily there was like already one book out there in the market that had done that, and it was your book. I think that's basically. At least I haven't like seen like almost any other kind of like science-based book on the topic of meaning on the market before your book appeared. So I was like quite happy to see that. And I also like actually when it came out, I convinced this one Finnish publisher that they should also like publish a Finnish translation to the book. So I was like wanted to get that word out also in Finland about the book, because I like it quite much. So thanks for writing the book and like providing the inspiration through that. And as regards my own book, so I guess like it was already also like quite long in the making. That I said I've been doing like research on the topic for I don't know, something like 10 years. So it's been something that the topic of meaning has been with me for a long time, and I've been trying to like figure out, look at the like kind of like the psychology of the topic, the philosophy of the topic, and approach it from different angles and trying to figure out what is it all about. And few years ago, I had this feeling that hey, now I have like some kind of like clarity around the topic, that now would be finally the time to book all that I know about the topic into one book. And that's how like this process towards this book started. And I was thinking like in this introductory remarks, I might like give you like 3 points from the book, and it will be like because the book tries to cover like quite a broad topic. So it's also about like it's about the history of the topic, it's about the philosophy of the topic, it's about the psychology of the topic. So I thought that I will give you like one historical point, one philosophical point, and one psychological point about the topic of meaning. And the historical point is that when we think about the question of meaning of life, we quite often think about it as this like eternal question that has been like asked since the dawn of mankind. So I was like actually quite surprised to find out that the exact phrase meaning of life is actually quite a recent invention. That it was only in 1834 that Thomas Carlyle, who is this like Scottish author who was like really influential in the 19th century, he wrote in his like this best-selling book Sartor Resartus, the word meaning of life. And that seems to be the first time that like the whole phrase was used in English. English language. And he got the phrase from like few German authors who had been like a couple of decades earlier talking about der Sinn des Lebens, which is like the German equivalent to the phrase meaning of life. So there seemed to be like something happening in the like early 19th century that made this topic of meaning like salient and like requiring its own word. And when I dug into that topic, I felt that, you know, actually that the key transition that was taking place during the times, of course, there was like many things happening in the early 19th century. There had been like, you know, the French Revolution had been quite influential in changing the political landscape. The Industrial Revolution was like changing how people do work, and also the people were like, urbanization was like spreading, people were moving to the cities and so forth. But still I felt, you know, that the most important transition as regards this topic of meaning was the rise of the scientific worldview. Because the scientific worldview was kind of like challenging human beings' place in the cosmos. That before that we thought we were kind of like the center of the universe, but suddenly the scientists were telling us that, you know, actually the world has existed millions of years before us, the world will exist millions of years after us, and actually we are just this like, you know, this random accidental products of these blind laws of the evolution and nature. And that was kind of like the crisis that quite many of these authors who first wrote about the meaning were like experiencing, that they encountered the scientific worldview, and through that they like it came to challenge their like, you know, their old beliefs about themselves and about the purpose in life, and they required a word for something that they were like feeling that they're missing, and then they invented the word meaning of life to describe something that was no longer like self-evident, that was something that suddenly was like questioned. So that's kind of like the historical kind of like point, that, you know, instead of being like this eternal question, the modern way of asking about meaning of life is actually like quite a recent thing, that it came into being in the last couple of centuries. Then the philosophical point is that there's actually two separate questions about meaning, and we often like mix them together, but like it might be like good idea to like try to keep them separate. So one is this question about meaning of life, which is more this like philosophical question about like, is there like meaning to life as such? Is there some like external thing that gives purpose and meaning to all life on earth and all human life, or all human beings? So that's one question that we can ask, and depending on our like, you know, philosophical and religious frameworks, we might like give different answers to that question. But then there's this other question, which is more about this meaning in life. So not meaning of life, but meaning in life, and that's more like a personal question. It's a question about now, do I experience my own life as meaningful? So it's like, instead of being like a metaphysical question, it's more like psychological question. It's something that, you know, I can like resolve for myself. Like, do I experience meaningfulness or do I not experience meaningfulness, and how much do I experience it in my own life? And if you dear member of the audience, came to the talk wishing to have like this question of meaning of life solved, then I'm like, you know, sorry to say that I don't have like very good answer to that question. But the question that I think that we can like get quite, you know, good answers to is the question of meaning in life, because there's like more and more psychological research taking place, and through that we already know what are the typical factors that usually make most of us life quite meaningful. And also the research has actually shown that another thing which is like important to say aloud is that, you know, that actually our lives usually are already quite meaningful. That according to research, most people most of the time experience their lives already as quite meaningful. So the meaningfulness to our like the meaning in life doesn't come from like, you know, like any grand things, or it's not something that is only like, you know, reserved for the few and the selected, but it's something that most of us already experience, because the things that like make our life meaningful are actually quite mundane and quite everyday things. And that brings us to my psychological question, or psychological point, which is about, you know, that there's Emily already like mentioned her like 4 pillars of meaning, and in my book I also have like these 4 kind of like these pathways to meaningfulness. And actually there's like one that we share, and that's like this sense of belonging and that these close relationships. That seems to be something that research shows that, you know, most of us, when we think about what makes our life meaningful, we start to think about our family, we start to think about our friends. So for most people, this sense of meaningfulness comes quite much from like this close relationship. So it's not about like how many friends you have, like it's not about the quantity of like relationships, but it's about the quality of relationships. Having a few people in your life that you truly care about, who care about you, and you have this like sense of connection with, that's what like most of us feel is highly meaningful. And being able to spend time with those people usually where we like get this like everyday sense of meaningfulness from. So that's one of these pathways. The second thing I think is like worth highlighting the sense of contributing, being able to do something positive in the life of other people, feeling that my actions have some kind of like positive impact. That's also something that like lots of research shown that's quite an important part of our sense of meaningfulness. That when we are able to feel that, hey, I'm touching other people's life in a positive way, it can be through our work that we can feel that, my work is doing through my work am I contributing. It can be, that I'm helping my family. It can be that I'm giving money to charity or whatever, but like bigger and smaller things where we feel that we are able to make an impact, that those are like quite important sorts of meaning as well. So based on that, I used to say that, this my one sentence answer to the question of meaning was that meaning in life is about making yourself meaningful to other people. So the way that my life becomes meaningful is when I feel that I'm meaningful to other people, and I'm meaningful to other people through being able to contribute and through having these relationships where people care about me and I care about them. Then at one point I realized that that's like only half the answer to the question of where the meaningfulness comes from, because like even though it's about like connecting to other people, it still like misses the part of like connecting to yourself. That the other half of where the meaningfulness comes from is also about being able to connect to oneself, and that's quite much about first about knowing who you are, knowing being in touch with yourself and being able to somehow realize yourself through your actions. So living a life that is like chosen by yourself instead of being like pushed along by other people or just like doing whatever other people are requiring me to do. So that's kind of like the third pillar of, or third like pathway to meaning is like this like sense of autonomy and sense of authenticity. And then the fourth one is about this sense of like mastery, feeling that I'm able to accomplish things in my life. I'm able to somehow like feel that I'm talented in what I do, and also that I'm growing and learning, because like through growing and learning we feel that that our sense of mastery is growing through time. So that's kind of like the fourth pathway to meaningfulness. So I guess like that's my introductory words, and now it will be like interesting. I said like that I think like Emily had these four pillars and I had these four pathways, and even though there's like some overlap, there's also like some like things that like I mentioned and she didn't, and the other way around. So I think that might be a stimulating way to start the conversation.
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for your remarks. They were wonderful and brilliant. I particularly like the point that you made about kind of the historical sources of why meaning became important, and maybe how those causes from like, urbanization and the rise of the scientific method, disenchantment, might still be affecting our lives today. I love your four pathways. And you mentioned earlier that you were happy that my book came out first because it showed a market, but I really wish I had read your book before I'd written mine, because some of the points that you make in it are so profound. And I think they really fill in missing pieces to some of my own ideas about meaning. And in particular, I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more about the piece about connecting more to ourselves. And I think the reason why I want to highlight that is because for a lot of people during this pandemic, they've lost their jobs, a way of making a positive impact to others, their relationships, they're not seeing people. Some of these pathways to meaning that you write about and that I write about are not as available to them. But in all this time that we spend at home, maybe there is room for introspection, and maybe this is an opportunity to build that pathway towards meaning. So can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
So I guess like it's about like being in touch with yourself, like the sense of authenticity. There's like one like interesting piece of research like this by this Rebecca Schlegel, and she like asked people to write about that. One group of like asked to write about that their true self, what they're like, what they're truly like. Another group of people were asked to write about their everyday self, how they behave in like everyday situations. And then they ask people like how much they experience a sense of meaningfulness. And it turned out that, you know, it didn't matter like as regards like writing about your like everyday self. And actually there was like a third condition which were like asked to write about the campus bookstore. And when they look at these answers, like how long or how detailed people were writing, like actually like writing about the bookstore, it didn't matter like did you write like long or short, people like experience the same level of meaningfulness. And the same for this like this sense of like kind of like this everyday self, that, you know, that didn't matter did you write longer or shorter about that, you like those people who like wrote longer or those people who wrote shorter like experience the same amount of meaningfulness. But then there were the group of people who were asked to write about, you know, their true self, what they're like truly like. And the longer you were able to write about that kind of topic, like the longer and more detailed writing you provided for that topic, those people like experience more meaningfulness than the other people who like wrote a shorter like story about that topic. So they can like, they knew better, were better in touch with who they are, like, and because of that probably they are able to like more realize themselves in everyday situations. So it's like about both like knowing who you are and then like being able to put that knowledge into action, like making sure that you're doing the things that you find valuable and interesting, instead of like, you know, just doing things that other people push you towards doing. And I think that it's true that, you know, in this pandemic time, it might be like for many people a time for like self-exploration, that, you know, because of the normal activities, normal hobbies have stopped, many people are now looking for like new ways to like, you know, express themselves, new ways to realize themselves, and through that they might learn something new about themselves and what are their actually interests. So there might be like, you know, some good long-term outcomes, at least for some people, that some people probably have already found a new side about or a new hobby for themselves through which they feel that they're able to better able to express themselves than they were before.
So it sounds like if somebody wants to walk that particular pathway towards meaning, you know, getting in touch with yourself, maybe a good place to start is just reflecting on what you think your true self is, and if this true self is not the one that you experience or gets like shown to the everyday world.
Yeah. And I think like there's like probably like two ways to get in touch with yourself. One is like through this introspection, you know, reflecting on yourself, perhaps like doing some like, you know, written exercises where you like try to write about your values or your interests or whatever. But I guess like the other dimension is about, you know, just like exploring different things, because like good way of like learning about yourself is just like exposing yourself to new situations, doing like things that you haven't been like before done. So I think that would be like, you know, another way like, you know, trying to like get in touch with yourself. But I think at least these four pillars that you or like four pillars for meaning that you had, like, because I tried to like somehow wrap my head around like about the difference between like our four sources or pathways to meaning. And I think like as regards this purpose of storytelling, that they seem to be like more about like time in a way, that my pathways are not, that my pathways like something that, you know, you might, you know, experience right here, right now. But this purpose is like clearly like future oriented thing, that, you know, like you're orienting yourself towards something in the future. And storytelling is also quite often like, you know, oriented towards the past in a way, that, you know, like you're weaving a story of your life and like trying to like narrate things into a coherent whole. So in that sense, I'm kind of like trying to say that we are not like, you know, in a disagreement about the sources of meaning, because I would agree that both the sense of purpose and this storytelling are probably very important ways of like getting meaningfulness, but they're like kind of like in a different level in a way, that, you know, that the needs that I'm talking about, they're like kind of like something that happened here and now, and these two pathways, they take more into account this, like, you know, that we're beings in time, that we live not only in the present moment but also in the future and also in the past.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. I think so. When I was thinking about your four pathways, I guess, and I agree with you, I don't see things between ours that contradict one another. I think that probably, you know, if I would have kind of, you know, 10 years looked at the same kind of research that I looked at when I was writing my book, I might have kind of called the pillars different things. And so I think we really are talking about something similar. And with purpose, I see a connection to your pathway about making a significant impact in some way on the world, being meaningful. Because one thing I learned when I was writing about purpose, well, first of all, I think that purpose is a term that gets really overused. I think it's become cliche almost. I don't know what it's like in Finland, but here in the United States, there's so much emphasis on, oh, find your purpose, and companies are all, claiming to be purpose driven these days. And it's just become a buzzword and almost a cliche. And I think that for a lot of people, they believe that they have to go out and find their, capital P purpose in order to have purpose in life, or to kind of satisfy this meaning, this pillar of meaning. And what I found was that actually purpose was more of an attitude. You live with purpose, and the people who adopted that attitude believe their lives were more meaningful. But specifically, what was at the center of that attitude was this idea that everything I do is an opportunity to kind of make a positive impact in the world in some way, or to make myself meaningful in the role that I play. A lot of parents told me that their purpose was raising their children. I remember I spoke to a Buddhist who told me that, for me, like, I find purpose in just washing the dishes, because it's a way to kind of contribute to, the maintenance of the world, the creation of home, things like that. And so I think this like attitude of living with purpose, and how it's really about making some positive impact in the world, no matter what the scale or the size is really is something that I kind of have taken away from my research. So that's kind of where I see a point of convergence. And with storytelling, I think that there's a point of convergence with your emphasis on kind of connection to self. Because really, when I'm talking about storytelling, what I'm talking about is the story that we tell ourselves, about how we became, how you became the person that you are today, the experiences that shaped you. And so, like you said, that's very much looking back and trying to integrate all the experiences that shaped you and have made you into the person that you are today. But I also think that there's a future element to it as well, because a lot of us have a story about our future that we want to live out. Maybe you're in college and you have this dream of, having a family, children, having a certain kind of work. And so I think like storytelling can kind of help us bridge, past, present, and future. And that's why it kind of gives this sense of coherence that is important to meaning.
Yeah. Also like your point about this, this purpose with capital P, and how that gets like almost like it has become this buzzword that can actually be like almost harmful to people, that because I also like when I started out with like doing research on meaning, and when I was like giving lectures in the university, I was like more talking about calling, like that you have to find yourself a calling. That I was like giving that kind of message to the students. But at some point I like stopped using the word calling almost like totally in my lectures or in my writings, because I actually, in the end, I feel that most people, that of course there are a few people who will have this like very strong sense of calling towards some like occupation, and then they give everything to that, and that's fine for them. But I think like in the end, for most people, the sense of meaningfulness doesn't come through having this like this grand calling or this purpose with capital P, but it comes from like this more mundane things that that one is doing some kind of work where one is able to there's some parts of the work that one is able to learn something new. There's like some nice colleagues at work that you're able to interact with, or with some clients that you're able to interact with. And also this sense of like contribution usually comes from like quite mundane things, that you're not curing cancer, or finding some vaccine for the COVID-19, but you're rather helping your friend, or helping somebody in your neighborhood, doing these like small things to help your spouse with the disease or whatever. Like it's it's more that the meaningfulness in our everyday life is more about these small things, rather than that everybody is required to have this capital P purpose or sense of calling, which I don't think is like something that it might not even be like healthy for many people, because like having this too strong sense of calling can be like a double-edged sword in a way. That there's like, of course it might guide your life and energize you, but at the same time it can like burn you out quite easily, that if you all your life is just like concentrating on this one single goal.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that what we're both trying to do in a sense is trying to bring meaning down to earth for people a little bit. Because that's another term, that kind of capital M meaning, and it's so abstract. And I think we're going to have to open it up to Q&A in just a second with the audience, but I'd love to ask you just one more question, because the term calling, it's a word that has a religious history. People felt called to God, or, with the Protestant Reformation, that your calling was a way to serve God and serve mankind. And I'm curious, in your research, your academic research, but also the research for your book, what role did you see religion and spirituality playing in a meaningful life? And what does that mean for people who might, who are living in a secular culture for whom religion isn't really part of their lives?
Yeah, I guess we know from research that those people who are like religious, for them, like usually like this religiousness provides them like one like key source of meaningfulness into their lives. So that's true. But I guess like in writing this book, I tried to write in with keeping in mind that, I want the book to be like, address both like religious and non-religious people. I was like trying to figure out what are the pathways towards meaning that we can like all agree on, no matter our religious like commitments or religious background. What are the things that like can like unite us humans, no matter this like these kind of things. But at the same time, of course, like, from the historical point of view, it's clear that, the meaningfulness used to be quite like much entangled with like this sense of religiousness. And that's what like people like a few hundred years ago, if they would have been asked like, does human life have a purpose? They will be like, give the answer like as something like quite self-evident because of the religious background from where they come from. And so that it was kind of like the clash between the religious worldview and the more secular scientific worldview that brought many people to ask this question about meaningfulness. And in that sense, like just like a final point is that, that even people who are religious today are religious in a different way than people like a few hundred years ago, because even those people are like kind of like aware of the alternative. They know they know like there might be some friends of theirs who are non-religious. They know that there's like atheistic people around them, and they know that that's like that they kind of like they have to self-identify as religious people because they know about the alternative. While like a couple of hundred years ago, like there wasn't an alternative, so people didn't like think of themselves as religious people because there wasn't like anything else than religious people. So it was like just this kind of like self-evident background understanding of how life works that was so self-evident that one didn't even like think about it. But today, even like highly committed religious people know that there's an alternative existing, even though they are not committed to that. So that's kind of like a key difference, I think, compared to like the previous times.
Yeah, it's like one of the problems of meaning. It's like a blessing and a curse almost, is that when you have all these options, you have to choose. It's not, everyone's not religious anymore, so you have to choose your own path, and that can be hard, but it can also be super liberating.
Yeah, it's both liberating, but it can be a burden because like it's actually not so easy to choose. It might oftentimes it's much easier when somebody says you when there is some clarity around the topic and somebody says you how you should live your life.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
thank you both so much. Yeah, so thank you both so much. So sorry to kind of barge in there. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Watson from East City Bookshop. I'm going to be now just moderating for both Frank and Emily questions from the audience. Thank you so much to everyone who's already submitted them. If you have not yet, you have questions for really wonderful panelists, please go ahead and use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and we'll get them answered. So first, and I think this is something that you both have spoken to in already, but just to kind of like maybe sum it up, Justine asks to both of you, do you have any new insight into the topic of meaning since the pandemic, or has the pandemic just reaffirmed your research?
Yeah, I guess like in a way, I would think that, of course, like I guess like the pandemic has somehow like highlighted that the need for meaningfulness. That I guess like because of this pandemic, when the normal life has stopped for many people, and there's like there has been all these like transitions and like new fears and everything. Probably more people are now thinking about the topic of meaning that they were like 1 year ago. So in that sense, like this is something that probably has like highlighted the topic of meaning more than before. And I feel like when I've been thinking like how people are answering the question of how they're like trying to like react to this pandemic, like one thing is that I think that many people seem to be like, when they think about their work, they might be thinking that, hey, there's this like grand global crisis happening. and how does my work contribute to like solving that? So like I heard like many people like feeling that, you know, that the work that they've did and which was like felt really meaningful 1 year ago, they now might have these like moments when they think that, hey, is this really worth doing right now? Shouldn't I be doing something which is like, you know, more meaningful? I even had like these moments like myself in the springtime when I was like writing a couple of papers, and then like things started to happen. I felt that, no, why the hell am I writing these papers? Like, you know, how does this like going to be contributing to the thing that's happening around me? So I kind of like had to stop with those papers and start to figure out, you know, what do I know through my, you know, research and everything that could be like useful in this present moment? What could I do, like, you know, what kind of research I could do which would be like more helpful, like addressing the situation that people are right now in. So I think that that's something it's happening right now, that many people are questioning the meaningfulness of their work or of their like activities, and thinking how they could better contribute to this moment.
Thanks so much, Frank. Emily, how about your work and your writing, and has it again, to review it, it's just, has the pandemic changed your perspective, or is it just reaffirmed like prior beliefs about meaning that you had?
I think it's, you know, it's definitely caused me to view the research with kind of a new frame of mind. And when I think now, that really stands out to me. Two things really. One is partly related to what Frank and I were talking about earlier, which is the kind of ordinariness, that finding meaning in the ordinary aspects of day-to-day life. And I think for so many people, like, life feels very monotonous on the one hand, because you're not really leaving you don't leave home, then like the home work boundary becomes confused, children are home, you're kind of dealing with them. It's kind of, there's just a lot going on. And a lot of people have lost a sense of order and routine while they're dealing with like the suffering and the pain and the loss of control and anxiety of the pandemic. And one thing one idea that I remember coming upon in the research that I didn't write so much about, I don't think, in my book, but I think is particularly relevant now, is how like the habits and rituals of day-to-day life are ways that we can like program meaning into our life. And that I think in particular, given how people are living their lives right now, can break up the monotony. So, you know, things like, I write about transcendence. And so things like going out for a walk and kind of being immersed in nature, making that part of your routine, or, you know, having dinner, you know, where you sit down at a table and that's kind of a ritual of meaning that you do with your family. And I think that piece, the importance of rituals and habits for meaning, is something that's really come alive to me. And I think it also helps me think about the topic of religion that Frank and I were talking about earlier too. And I think part of the reason why religion offers and has historically offered so much meaning to people isn't necessarily because of the dogma, but because of like how it ritualizes so many aspects of day-to-day life and makes it feel connected to something transcendent. And so kind of that way of looking at things has stayed with me and been on my mind as I work through the pandemic and my own, you know, ways of dealing with it. And the second thing is, you know, Viktor Frankl had this idea of tragic optimism, where he talks about how, you know, life is full of suffering and pain and loss and grief and death. And yet, in spite of all that, we have the ability to hold on to hope and to continue to believe that life is meaningful. And I think that piece of like holding on to the hope, remembering that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, is important.
Wow.
Go
ahead, Frank. Sorry. Go ahead, Frank.
As regards to Frankl's point that Emily mentioned last, I had like just add that one word that I've been like, or one philosopher that I've been like using this one has been like John Dewey, who's this like American pragmatist, and he has this like word meliorism that describes his attitude to life. So, you know, there's like pessimism, there's optimism, and then there's meliorism, which is about, you know, that the world is not the worst possible, the world is not the best possible, but it can be improved. That there's something I can do to like make it better. And that's kind of like his attitude. Let's try to like accept those things that we cannot change. There's like bad things happening and there's not much that we can do about them, but there's always something that we can still influence. It might be that the circle of influence might be quite small, but there's always something that we can do, at least to help our own lives or the lives of our, like, the people close to us. So let's focus on that and try to improve that. that's kind of like his kind of like attitude that I think is also quite applicable to the present situation.
That actually lines up, everything that y'all were just saying lines up pretty well with this other question that one of our attendees had, which is referring to, he said, if purpose is found more in the small things than in a grand calling, that speaks to the rituals you were talking about, Emily, and so on, would it be fair to say it's about one's values, knowing one's values and living in accordance with them from moment to moment? I just thought that lined up pretty well with what you were both just describing. So Frank, for example, about maybe you would only have like a smaller influence, but it's, you know, one you can still have. So how would you all think about values in relation to daily life and finding meaning?
Yeah, I would at least say that, you know, that in a way, like meaning is very much connected to values, because meaningfulness in general is about, you know, trying to figure out what makes my life valuable, what makes my life what kind of like intrinsic value is there in my life. So in that sense, like, you know, I feel that, yeah, if you know what you value, and if you're able to like realize those values through your life, that's what meaningfulness might quite much about. And then kind of like my further argument will be that then like few of the key values that most of us have are about these close relationships, about contribution, about autonomy and so forth. But like, yeah, meaningfulness is about on a general level about being able to realize your values through your life and feeling that your life has some value.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I'm thinking of the study that you mentioned earlier, Frank, too, with Rebecca Schlegel, and kind of your true self and your everyday self. And I think, you know, to kind of take one step beyond that concept, I think a lot of people, we all have like our true self. And then for some people, maybe for a lot of people, there's like a false self that they're actually living out because they're living by someone else's values or by the culture's values. Part of like what, you know, inspired me to write my book was that I saw that so many people were living by the values of this kind of happiness culture, and it wasn't satisfying to them. And so I think really clarifying what your values are, which I think goes back to that pathway of yours, Frank, about self-knowledge, is really important to leading a meaningful life. Because if like your values are not congruent with the life that you're leading, there's just so much research to suggest, and I think personal experience too, that can create pain and misery.
Yeah, quite often we follow this like more these extrinsic values, or like values that, you know, that are not truly ours, but something that we picked up from like people around us that think that they want us to do these things. And if we like, you know, if we develop ourselves to have this like, you know, this false self that, you know, it doesn't matter how much people are accepting us or how much people like care about us, but if you're like, you know, if you're representing a wrong self to them, it doesn't like help us much our own self-esteem, because we feel that, you know, we are only accepted because we are like playing out this role that is not truly ourselves. So in that sense, it's very important to, you know, be able to somehow know who you are and be able to like somehow live a life that is true to that, rather than, you know, just trying to live out the role that is not you.
That makes so much sense, like the connection between values and authenticity, kind of what you were saying, like just finding like an actual true self and being reinforced and through daily rituals and connections with other people, as you were talking about, Frank. So somebody had kind of a related way, a question: what are some practical strategies to build a sense of meaning in life when one has experienced a loss of that core during a difficult time? So I know that, Emily, you were referring to Frankl. Obviously, that's an extreme scenario in terms of like a major loss. But at the same time, I mean, there are lots of people, I'm sure many people that are attending and so on, going through, in addition, a kind of a sense of grief or loss from the collective situation right now, also potentially in their own families, communities, and stuff like that. How, what are some practical strategies of how you all would apply some of your lessons and thoughts to build a sense of meaning there in the face of loss right now?
Yeah, and I think I'm thinking about this study that came out, I don't know, maybe like 8 years ago or something, about how people coped with the loss of their parents. And I think if I remember correctly, the participants in the study were mostly college students, so they were young. And so kind of an unexpected loss, you know, when you're 50, maybe it's not so unexpected, but when you're younger, it is. And one of the things that the researchers found was, again, that there were, when people were able to somehow cope through implementing a ritual in their life, that allowed them to kind of be more resilient and to just to kind of move through the grief in a way that wasn't so debilitating. And so some of the rituals were really sweet, you know, like a woman who lost her mother, you know, wore like her mother's earring. So the ritual kind of connected them to whatever that loss was. And I think that, you know, there's a few things going on there. One, it's you have to encounter the loss and be willing to kind of face it, and maybe in facing it, you make sense of it a little bit. And that relates to some of the stuff I was talking about storytelling, kind of creating a narrative around it to help make sense of it. You know, why did this happen? What's happened as a result? How did I grow from it? And also just kind of maintaining a connection to whatever it was that you lost, and not having to kind of just get over it the way people say that you have to. I think, like, I was reading, you know, in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, it's how psychologists and psychiatrists diagnose mental illness. And there was something about bereavement, and it talked about how, like, bereavement becomes clinically, becomes a clinical condition. You know, there's something wrong with you. If it's like, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was like several months. And I thought, wow, like, some people go their whole lives grieving the people they love. And I think that's okay, to recognize that that's okay.
Yeah, I think, like, Emily answered that question quite well. Just like one thing I want to add is, like, you know, that I agree that research shows that, you know, that in this situation, when we lose something, it's like, it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel these negative feelings. That the worst thing that we can do is, like, try and, like, you know, suffocate these negative feelings. Don't accept that we are having them. That, you know, through not accepting certain feelings, we usually, like, come to strengthen them. So it's like, kind of like trying kind of like accepting what has happened, and accepting the feelings that one has is, like, you know, much better strategy than trying to fight against the feeling or not accept the situation.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and those are some really useful practical strategies at the present moment. And then we had a question from Frank, from your agent. We had Elina had some questions, both for you as well as Emily. Elina asked, she said, your book has been translated in several languages. In which countries are you most excited to hear readers' reactions? Because I know in our chat, and we're so thrilled, people tuning in from all around the world, you know, you have a pretty diverse audience at this point, Frank. You know, where are you most excited to hear people's responses from?
Yeah, because of my, like, training in philosophy, which is, like, quite that much about, like, the Western philosophy. So, like, my book is, like, quite much still about kind of like European, or like European and American thinking, which that's like the most of the research that I've been, like, reading, and most of the philosophy I've been reading comes from that tradition. So it's interesting that the book is going to be translated into like Japanese and Korean languages, which are, like, already quite different cultures. And that's something that, you know, at some point I want to, like, expand my, like, ideas about meaningfulness beyond the Western culture and learn more about, you know, the Japanese concept of ikigai, which is, like, seems to be quite similar to the concept of meaning. So I would be very interesting to have these conversations with some Japanese people about, like, how they react to the book, and what is their, like, take on the topic of meaningfulness.
Excellent. And then Emily, the same question was posed to you, but instead it was just shared as, can you share some of the feedback from readers since your book's been out for a bit? Can you share some of the feedback from readers in different countries? It's kind of broad, but still, I mean, it kind of continues on from Frank. I would imagine there's been a diversity of reactions. I mean, we have Frank speaking from Finland, so obviously it went, you know, pretty far, but at the same time, you know, like, across cultures or countries, or what's been some of the most interesting feedback that you have in your book?
Honestly, I think that, just as a kind of a very general answer to that question, it's made me realize that everywhere that I have at least heard from people around the world, or have had, you know, the privilege to travel to talk to people about these ideas, everywhere that I've been and have heard from people, there is this yearning to know about these questions of meaning and value and purpose. People want to understand what makes their lives meaningful. You know, there, and so it's led me to believe that, you know, what a lot of the philosophers and psychologists say is true, that we have a need for meaning that's as, you know, powerful to our psychological, spiritual, you know, emotional well-being as the need for food, water, shelter are for physical well-being, and that without it we suffer, and when we have it we flourish. And so I think that just you know, to people who might not be paying attention to meaning and feel like there's something missing within them, I think that the reaction on the international level to Frank's book and to, you know, to the people I've spoken to as well, shows that there is this kind of universal desire for meaning.
Wow. Well, I could see why. This is a pretty interesting conversation. And again, I mean, I feel like a lot of these questions and answers are kind of becoming like recursive in a sense, right? They keep coming with like pandemic and how people need this and so on and so forth. Next one is from Bia. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your name. Bia Pedersen. Do you believe there is a cultural shift away from people living congruently with principles we should uphold? Is there a disconnect between us and meaning due to this? You guys can look at the Q&A exactly if you want to see the way it's phrased.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, I would want to believe that there's a cultural shift away from like living like based on the principles that we should uphold, but I'm not sure that that's the reality. I think that, you know, that's something that, you know, I want to like help people to like somehow through this book and other like work that, you know, try to help people to live more congruently with who they are themselves instead of like, you know, living how they should be living. But I actually think that, you know, even the whole phenomenon of social media is also probably like even like increased people like sense of like that they are living their lives through like the way that they are like representing themselves towards the other people rather than like concentrating on how they're like experiencing things themselves. That, you know, that when you experience something that you're already thinking about, you know, hey, this would make a great picture on Instagram, or this would make a great picture on Facebook, instead of like, you know, experiencing the thing itself. So like, I'm not so optimistic always about that we are like getting away from this, but like, but I still think it's worth the fight, you know, try to help people to live more authentically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I'll just add that I think that, you know, there are values in our culture that aren't so aligned with leading a meaningful life, like materialism, chasing success, those kinds of things. And they're pretty pervasive, and individualistic, like hyper individualistic values as well, that kind of take us away from community. And so those are some that I think could pose kind of challenges to those of us living in cultures dominated by those values to kind of break away from them to find our own path.
Thank you so much. That's great. And then we'll end on a question that I kind of saved for the end because I thought it would be a pretty good cap, which is to both of you, what gives you meaning in your lives? So.
Do you want to, I can go first. I'll give Frank the last word. So you know, for me, I you know, as a writer, and, you know, someone who is in school right now to become a clinical psychologist, stories, other people's stories that I read in novels, that is such an important part of meaning for me. I've learned so much through other people's stories, connecting to others through their stories, and also just feeling a little less alone in the world through those stories. So that's really important to me. Of course, like, you know, my relationships and my work I find really meaningful. But also just, you know, I talked about transcendence earlier. That's a really powerful portal for meaning for me, just having contact with something bigger, nature, you know, the present moment, meditating, things like that.
Awesome.
Yeah, like my answer is quite boring in that sense, because like, I guess like, research shows that the most like, you know, that the domains that the modern people usually find their sense of find like meaningfulness from is like work and family. And that's also like my case as well, that, you know, that I'm really, you know, excited about my own, like excited about being able to be a researcher, being able to, you know, like explore these questions, and, you know, have somebody pay me for like being able to read books and like write about these topics. So that's, you know, something that I find like highly meaningful. And feeling that, you know, through doing this research, I'm like contributing towards the science, and also through writing to the general audience, I like hopefully can touch somebody's life in a positive way. So like the work is like key part of meaningfulness. And then as regards family, I have like, with my wife, we have like 3 kids who are like 8, 6, and 4 years old. So in this moment, they're of course like very big part of the meaningfulness of my life. So it's kind of like, it's a boring answer, but it's a true answer that, you know, work and family are the sources of meaningfulness, even for me.